We're starting on volume 4 today. So, chapter 52. 3 gods, 1 ghost. Reverend nowhere in sight. Part 2. It darted in and tampered with the array when we left Puchi Shrine? Shi Qingxuan wondered, then instantly dismissed his own theory. No, it couldn't have. That isn't possible, Shilian agreed. We had already opened the door, so even if it crept in to meddle afterward, we should have still arrived at our original destination. The array was already activated. Changing it wouldn't have done anything at that point. It only had a split second to interfere. Which meant it happened in the moment after Mingyi had finished drawing the array, when Shi Qingxuan blew out the candles, and Puchi Shrine fell into darkness. However, that contradicted Shilian's own theory. But there were only the 4 of us in the shrine, Shi Qingxuan said. There had been 3 heavenly officials and 1 ghost king in Tiny Puchi Shrine. Wouldn't they have noticed if there was anyone or anything extra? And if someone among them had meddled in the darkness, who was the most likely culprit? Shi Qingxuan couldn't help but steal a glance at Huacheng. Although he stopped himself quite quickly, Huacheng didn't miss it. He smiled. What's with that look? Personally, I think Lord Earthmaster is the most suspicious one here. Don't you agree? Mingyi's eyes also swept over. Rather than worrying about who meddled after the fact, consider whether the array he drew was wrong from the start, Huacheng pointed out. Mingyi neither refuted nor acknowledged the accusation, but Shi Qingxuan couldn't let this line of questioning continue. Huachenzhu, you stop right there, all right? I know the 2 of you quarreled in the past, but Mingchong really isn't like that. I dragged him on this expedition and at the last minute to help me, so he has no reason to meddle. One doesn't always need a reason to do something, Huacheng said. Lord Windmaster, you're very suspicious too. Huh? Shi Qingxuan hadn't expected the tables to turn on him, and he pointed at himself. Who? Me? Mm-hmm. It's common for a wolf to cry wolf to shift the blame, Huacheng said. Why exactly are you here? If you and your esteemed brother are genuinely scared of the Reverend of Empty Words, why were those raggedy scrolls so sloppily cobbled together? It's not a stretch of the imagination to think that the 2 of you schemed to intentionally lead us here. It was easy to tell from his expression that he was being cheeky and spouting nonsense. But he'd made such a good point that anyone was now worth considering as a suspect. Even Shi Qingxuan was almost persuaded. Am I that ridiculous? Huacheng chuckled. The same logic applies to me. I'm not that ridiculous either. He would strike back with whatever others used to strike him. But Shilian was still busy mulling over the evidence, so he waved dismissively. All right, everyone stop. Nothing's clear yet, and we've already started doubting our own people. Huacheng laughed out loud and stopped talking. However, his attitude was more than obvious. He was purely there for fun. He wouldn't help, but he wouldn't cause mischief either. There was no point in expecting anything from him, but there was also no need to guard against him. After thinking for a moment, Shilian said, Actually, there's another possibility. When Lord Earthmaster was drawing the array inside the shrine, someone else might have already been drawing a stronger array on the other side of the door. Shi Qingxuan had cast an isolation spell to seal Puchi Shrine and prevent Qirong from listening at the door and eavesdropping on their discussion. But that spell also made it hard for those on the inside to easily detect whether someone was tampering with things outside. When 2 similar spells collided, the more powerful one always won, and power wasn't solely based on the caster's abilities. It also depended on the materials used when spellcrafting. Mingyi had used the aged cinnabar that Shilian picked up while collecting junk, stuff that had been discarded by his cultivation peers. If someone had used fresh blood to weave their own array, it would naturally be stronger. Shi Qingxuan eagerly accepted that possibility. Outside the shrine. Could it have been the green ghost? Can he do anything in his current state? I don't think so, Shilian said. He won't even dream of moving for the next week. But it wasn't just him outside the shrine, Huacheng said evenly, an implication hanging from his words. In any case, let's not panic, and let's not hurt our trust in each other, Shilian said. After pacing for a few steps, he added, But the monster's words were very strange. Why did it say that this place will become Lord Windmaster's nightmare, that he'll never wish to recall? Are we going to encounter something here? Shi Qingxuan looked around and wrinkled his brows. Wait, this place looks like... Before he finished, Mingyi's expression suddenly turned sharp. His hand struck out in a flash, and the move was aimed at the back of Shi Qingxuan's head. Lord Windmaster, look out behind you! Shilian shouted. Thwump. Mingyi's hand chop cracked a large, rectangular object in twain. The object had tumbled down right as Shi Qingxuan passed under it. He leapt a few paces away, patting his heart. That was close! He looked down and his pupils shrank. Xu Lian approached to take a look, and he tensed as well. The object was an establishment plaque, painted blue with golden characters, that proudly spelled, "The Temple of Wind and Water." Shattering the establishment plaque of a heavenly official's temple was an enormous taboo. Mingyi dropped his hand, his expression icy. Shi Qingxuan stood in numb shock for a moment, but he then spirited away the broken pieces of the plaque with a sweep of his sleeve. "Keep this a secret. Nobody speak of this," he said in a low voice. "If my brother finds out one of his plaques got smashed, he'd be totally furious." Xu Lian turned to look around the room, and his tone was of disbelief. "This is a temple of wind and water?" Indeed, the broken-down house they had been transported to was a temple of wind and water. The Water Master was the god of wealth. No one hates money, so the temples that worshipped him always had donations in abundance. To see one of his temples desecrated was as unimaginable as seeing a bundle of cash discarded on the street, exposed to the elements and ignored by passerby. Shi Qingxuan rushed back into the main hall. The interior of the temple was desolate from neglect and heavy with cobwebs and dust. He rummaged around, then finally pulled two wretched-looking divine statues from beneath a pile of rubbish. The divine statue of the Lady Windmaster was missing a leg and an arm, and the head of the divine statue of the Lord Watermaster was broken off altogether. The damage didn't look like it was from decay, but rather like someone had used something sharp to smash them, as if they were venting immeasurable hatred onto the statues. The divine statues were extremely realistic, too, almost lifelike. It was exceedingly unsettling to see them lying on the floor of this eerie old temple in such a state of abuse, one still wearing a curved smile on its face. Shi Qingxuan hugged a divine statue in each arm. "What kind of hatred is this?" he wondered aloud. "What grudge?" Even though Xu Lian could sense a strong, malicious intent from this scene, he replied gently to keep Shi Qingxuan calm. "Lord Windmaster, steady yourself. As long as there are those who worship, there will also be those who desecrate. It's a common thing in the mortal world. No need to pay it any mind. The creature must have set this up intentionally, to fan fear in your heart and allow it to absorb your spiritual power." Mingyi, however, was more succinct in his response. "Are you okay or not? If you can't handle this, leave." Shi Qingxuan brushed away some of the dust off the divine statues. He gritted his teeth, gripped his Windmaster fan, and leapt to his feet. "I'm fine. Now I have to see what this creature's got up its sleeves." The four of them exited the run-down temple of wind and water, and walked around the little town. It was a very quiet, peaceful place. Not bustling, but modern and well-kept. Nothing out of the ordinary. Rather, the most peculiar thing there was the four of them. Their appearances, bearing, and dress were much too conspicuous to blend into a crowd of mortals. They ducked into a small alley for a costume change. Xu Lian was already dressed quite plainly, so he didn't need to change. However, the other three changed their looks thoroughly from head to toe. On one side of the alley, Shi Qingxuan voiced his critique of Mingyi's new getup. On the other side, Hua Cheng changed into a set of refreshing black robes. His long hair was tied up neatly and properly, which was a rare sight. Complemented by a white jade hair accessory, the new style changed his languid appearance into something more spirited. He looked like an extraordinarily handsome and intelligent young disciple of some renowned orthodox sect, and instinctively eye-catching, as intensely eye-catching as always. An emperor simply couldn't look like a beggar even if you forced him to dress like one. As he gazed at him, Xu Lian couldn't help but remember the saying, "For men to impress, in black they must dress." He reflected on the profound truth of this statement. Once his mind came down from the clouds, he looked at the Lord's Wind and Earth Master and remembered something. "Sunlung, there's something I've been meaning to ask you," Xu Lian whispered. Hua Cheng fixed his sleeves. "What is it?" Xu Lian clenched his hand into a fist, then pressed the fist to his lips. He cleared his throat lightly and tried to sound extremely casual. "What's the verbal password to your private communication array?" To directly send a message to someone's private spiritual array, one had to have their verbal password. For example, to reach Shi Qingxuan, one had to loudly recite in their mind the following daguerreotype. "Lord Windmaster is divinely gifted. Lord Windmaster is funny and carefree. Lord Windmaster is kind and righteous. Lord Windmaster is aged sweet 16. Of course, other heavenly officials didn't set up verbal passwords that were so embarrassing to say. Most were much more normal. The upper court heavenly officials didn't freely give away their verbal passwords. They only provided them to close friends or associates. As a supreme ghost king, Hua Cheng would naturally have the same standards. But although he and Xilian might not have known each other for long, their relationship was fairly good, and it was a little strange that they hadn't exchanged passwords yet. They'd always seen each other face to face every time there was something to address, so exchanging passwords hadn't ever seemed all that important. Xilian had never asked for the verbal password of any heavenly official. He'd call out in the general spiritual communication array whenever he needed assistance. If he wanted to speak to anyone privately, he would just ask for them in there. Since this was the first time he was the one asking for someone's private communication, he didn't have much prior experience and was a bit worried he might be acting too forward. And now Hua Cheng's eyes were twinkling, but the man didn't respond. So Xilian felt a little awkward. Is it inconvenient? If it is, don't worry and don't mind me, he hurriedly added. I was just asking, nothing serious. There's something I wanted to discuss privately later, which is why I made such a presumptuous request. I can also figure out a way to speak to you in secret. It's not inconvenient, Hua Cheng interrupted him. I'm very glad. Xilian was taken aback. Huh? Hua Cheng sighed. I'm very glad that Gaga finally asked me. You never brought it up, so I thought it would be inconvenient for you, that you didn't want to exchange passwords with anyone. And that's why I never asked either. But, Gaga, now that you've finally asked, how can you dismiss it as nothing serious? Xilian let out a breath of relief and brightened up, grabbing Hua Cheng's hand. So we were both concerned about the same thing. It was my fault just now. My nothing serious was the unserious comment. I apologize to Sanlang. So, your verbal password is? Hua Cheng's eyes shimmered, and he leant over. This is my verbal password. Gaga, listen closely. I'm only going to say it once. Then he whispered a phrase. Xilian's eyes widened once he heard. What? Is that really it? Sanlang, you didn't make a mistake? Hua Cheng was perfectly composed. Yup, that's it. If Gaga doesn't believe me, why not give it a try? As if Xilian dared. Then does that mean every time someone wants to talk to you, they have to mentally recite that phrase 3 times? Wouldn't that be extremely embarrassing? Hua Cheng snickered. I said it to that phrase because I don't want anyone to talk to me. It lets them know to back off. But if it's Gaga who wants to talk, I'm always free. Xilian felt a little incredulous. That's so mean. He hesitated. He wanted to initiate the private communication array, but he just couldn't bring himself to utter that password no matter how hard he tried. It was difficult even in his head. Xilian pressed his hand to his face and twisted his head away, unable to make up his mind for the longest time. Seeing him fretting, Hua Cheng finally had his fill of teasing. All right, fine. If Gaga dare not recite it, then I'll be the one to reach out to you. What's your verbal password? Xilian turned his head back. Just recite Dao De Jing 1,000 times. Hua Cheng cocked an eyebrow. A moment later, Xilian heard his voice next to his ear. It's the phrase, just recite Dao De Jing 1,000 times, right? The two stood facing each other, but their lips were closed and unspeaking. They were communicating with their eyes, whispering secrets to one another using a voice no others could hear. Xilian replied using the private communication array as well. That's right. Can't believe you weren't fooled. Hua Cheng blinked and continued to reply to his messages. I almost was. How fun. Xilian's delight was apparent as he blinked back. It must be known that this verbal password is something Xilian spent serious effort coming up with when he first ascended 800 years ago. He used it because he thought it was funny, but not many other heavenly officials appreciated the joke. Even after he revealed the trick, they were more speechless than entertained. Mu Qing told him bluntly, Your Highness, your joke is bad. Forgive me if I can't laugh at it. On the other hand, Feng Xin laughed to the point of rolling on the ground, screaming himself hoarse. But he laughed at almost any joke, no matter the quality, so sending him into hysterics didn't make Xilian feel the least bit accomplished. However, if Hua Cheng laughed, maybe it really was somewhat amusing after all. The original plan was to go to the best restaurant in the imperial capital to drink, but since they didn't make it to the imperial capital, it made no difference where they went. The group reserved a room at the biggest restaurant in town, and they lounged at the table, bored out of their minds. When the waiter brought their drinks, Xilian inquired, May I ask where we are? Although it was a strange, blunt question, it was still the most direct and effective way to gather information. The waiter was amazed. Did our honored guests not come because of our reputation? This is the town of Fugu. Reputation? What reputation? The waiter gave a thumbs up. Our town's fire social. It's really famous around these parts. At this time every year, a number of outsiders come to watch the spectacle. Shi Qingxuan was curious. What's a fire social? It's celebratory festivals during folk holidays, Xilian explained. There will be busking, local plays, and so on. They're worth seeing. They were similar to the Shengyong heavenly ceremonial procession of Shenle back in the day. However, heavenly ceremonial processions were sponsored by the monarch and hosted by the state. Fire socials were the entertainment of commoners. But it's not a holiday today, Shi Qingshun commented. The closest thing that tomorrow is Hanlu, the official end of autumn. It doesn't have to be a holiday, Shi Lian explained. Sometimes they're for commemorating a person or event. The common folk pick a special day to celebrate and have some fun. Just then, there was a huge commotion on the main street that stretched out below the restaurant. "Move aside! Move!" someone was shouting. "Women and children, don't stand around! Back away, the troops are coming!" The four looked below, and what a sight they saw! Shi Lian's eyes widened. A long procession paraded down the main street, and everyone in the line was painted with thick layers of vivid makeup and dressed in all sorts of bizarre costumes. There were also weapons embedded in each of their heads. Axes, butcher knives, iron tongs, scissors, implements both sharp and dull. All were deeply buried in their skulls, piercing their brains. Some even had their eyeballs squeezed from their bleeding sockets and dangling down their cheeks. Some had been stabbed all the way through their foreheads, and the weapon jutted out the back of their head in an exceedingly gory display. Every one of the paraders had tightly knitted brows and expressions scrunched in agony, and every face was covered in blood. And yet, they continued to slowly march forward amidst the trumpeting music, like a procession of phantoms. And that is chapter 52.